Anthony Davis moved through the quiet, dimly lit hallways of Roosevelt High School, pushing a well-worn janitor's cart with the same steady rhythm that had carried him through years of unacknowledged work. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, while the distant echoes of teenagers' laughter faded into the evening. At 62, Anthony had mastered the art of being invisible, slipping unnoticed among the bustling crowds of students and faculty. His routine was simple: arrive early, leave late, and keep the school running smoothly. But the weight of his past, a life no one at Roosevelt could begin to imagine, lingered like a shadow in his mind. For Anthony, the school wasn't just a workplace, it was an escape. Decades earlier, he had been a rising star in the world of karate, competing on national stages and earning respect for his discipline and precision. He had dreams of opening his own dojo, sharing his knowledge with the world. But one cruel twist of fate, a devastating knee injury during a championship match, shattered those dreams. Left grappling with physical pain and a bruised spirit, Anthony turned to a quieter life, channeling his passion into mentoring underprivileged kids in his neighborhood. Now Roosevelt High was his domain, even if no one cared to notice. Anthony found solace in the humblest of tasks, scrubbing graffiti from lockers, replacing light bulbs, and cleaning up after careless teenagers. But his peace was often interrupted by those who saw him as little more than a target for their amusement. Chris Miller was one of those teenagers. Charismatic and sharp-tongued, Chris ruled the school's social hierarchy with an iron fist, backed by a loyal group of friends who thrived on the chaos he created. On the surface, Chris seemed untouchable, always quick with a smirk or a joke that left others laughing at someone else's expense. But beneath his confident exterior was a 17-year-old boy grappling with pressures he couldn't articulate. His parents, both successful lawyers, demanded perfection, but they rarely noticed him beyond his report cards and athletic achievements. At school, his need to control his environment often manifested as cruelty, and Anthony, with his quiet demeanor, became an easy target. It began subtly. Chris and his friends would kick over trash cans in Anthony's path, scattering their contents across the floor. They'd leave sticky soda spills in the cafeteria and watch from a distance as Anthony mopped them up. Their laughter echoed through the hallways, sharp and cutting. Anthony never reacted. He would simply clean up the mess, his face impassive, his movements deliberate. One afternoon, as Anthony knelt to repair a broken locker hinge, Chris and his crew rounded the corner, their sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. "Hey, Mr. Karate Kid," Chris called out, the nickname an inside joke he'd coined after spotting an old karate patch on Anthony's work shirt weeks earlier. "You missed a spot." He kicked a discarded soda can toward Anthony, the metallic clang reverberating down the hall. Anthony paused, his hand still on the locker door. He turned his head slowly, meeting Chris's gaze. His dark brown eyes, lined with years of experience, held no anger, only a quiet strength that made Chris hesitate for a moment. Then, with a small nod, Anthony resumed his work, ignoring the taunts. From the far end of the hallway, Julia Parker watched the scene unfold. At 16, Julia wasn't the type to draw attention to herself. She kept her head down, her sketchpad clutched tightly to her chest as she navigated the tricky waters of high school. Ever since her parents' divorce, she'd felt adrift, her once stable world fractured. But she had found a sense of belonging in an unexpected place, Anthony's weekend karate classes. It had started a few months earlier, when Julia had stumbled across a flyer pinned to the community bulletin board. "Free karate lessons for beginners," it read, the details scrawled in neat handwriting. Curious and desperate for an outlet, she'd shown up at the local recreation center and found Anthony waiting with a patient smile. Under his guidance, she learned not just the movements of karate, but also the philosophy behind it, the importance of balance, discipline, and inner strength. Watching Chris humiliate Anthony stirred something in Julia, a mix of anger and guilt. She wanted to step forward, to say something, but her feet felt glued to the floor. Instead, she turned and walked away, her heart heavy with frustration. Later, that evening, during karate practice, Julia couldn't hold back any longer. As Anthony guided her through a sequence of kicks and punches, she blurted out, "Why do you let them treat you like that?" Anthony paused, lowering his hands. His calm expression didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, an old wound reopened. "Who?" he asked, though he clearly knew the answer. "Chris and his friends," Julia said, her voice trembling. "They're awful to you, and you just take it. Why?" Anthony sighed and gestured for Julia to sit on the floor. He joined her, folding his legs beneath him. For a moment, he stared at the scuffed mats, as if searching for the right words. "There's a saying in karate," he began. "A black belt is a white belt who never gave up." Julia frowned. "What does that have to do with them being jerks?" "It means," Anthony said, "that strength isn't about fighting back every time someone tries to knock you down. It's about choosing your battles, controlling your response. They can say or do what they want, but they don't define who I am. Only I can do that." Julia absorbed his words, but they didn't fully quiet the storm inside her. But what if they don't stop? What if they just keep pushing and pushing? Anthony smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time for them to learn a lesson they won't forget." Unbeknownst to either of them, Chris was already planning his next move. His frustration with Anthony's unshakable composure had reached a boiling point. He wanted to break through that calm exterior, to prove that even the quiet janitor had limits. And so he came up with an idea, a cruel prank that would not only humiliate Anthony but also make Chris the center of attention once again. The plan was simple. During the school's upcoming Spirit Week, Chris and his friends would stage an elaborate accident involving a bucket of dirty mop water and a hidden camera. The footage would go viral, cementing Chris's reputation as the king of pranks. But in his eagerness to tear someone else down, Chris failed to see the cracks forming in his own foundation. For Anthony, the storm brewing around him was nothing new. He had weathered worse, and he would weather this too. But he wasn't alone this time. Julia, with her fierce determination and growing sense of justice, was about to step into a role she never expected, defender of the quiet, unassuming man, who had taught her the true meaning of strength. The pieces were falling into place, and as the week progressed, the lines between teacher and student, bully and victim began to blur. It was only a matter of time before everything came to a head, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change their lives forever. The air in Roosevelt High School was thick with the energy of Spirit Week, a time when the usual routines gave way to chaotic games, themed costumes, and an endless stream of student-led activities. Brightly colored banners hung from the walls, and laughter filled the hallways. But for Anthony Davis, the festive atmosphere only meant more messes to clean and more opportunities for trouble to brew. He moved through the corridors with his usual calm demeanor, his janitor's cart loaded with supplies seemingly oblivious to the world around him. Chris Miller, on the other hand, thrived in the chaos. He strutted through the school like he owned the place, a smirk permanently etched on his face. His group of friends followed close behind, laughing at his jokes and egging him on. The prank Chris had planned for Anthony was all he could think about. He had spent hours detailing every aspect of it, down to the placement of the hidden camera. In his mind, it would be the perfect combination of humiliation and hilarity, solidifying his reputation as the king of the school. Julia Parker, however, could feel the tension brewing beneath the surface. She had noticed the way Chris and his friends lingered near Anthony's usual cleaning spots, whispering and exchanging glances. It was as if they were circling their prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The knot of frustration and guilt in her stomach tightened with each passing day. She had seen enough of their cruelty and couldn't stand by any longer. The breaking point came during lunch on Wednesday. Julia was sitting alone at her usual table near the back of the cafeteria, sketching absently in her notebook. She overheard bits of Chris's conversation with his friends at a nearby table. "Tomorrow during the pep rally," Chris said, his voice low but brimming with excitement. "We'll get the bucket ready beforehand. It'll be perfect. The whole school will see it." One of his friends snickered. "You think he'll even react? He's always so boring." "Oh, he'll react," Chris replied, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "And if he doesn't, we'll make him." Julia's heart raced as she pieced together their plan, her hands clenched into fists under the table. She couldn't let this happen, not to Anthony. He didn't deserve their cruelty, and she couldn't stand the thought of him being humiliated in front of the entire school. That evening, during karate practice, Julia struggled to focus. Her movements were sloppy, her mind consumed by what she had overheard. Anthony noticed her frustration and called for a break. "What's on your mind, Julia?" he asked gently, handing her a bottle of water. She hesitated, her grip tightening around the bottle. "It's Chris," she admitted. "Finally. He's planning something bad during the pep rally tomorrow." Anthony's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "What kind of something?" Julia took a deep breath, then explained everything she had overheard. As she spoke, the anger and helplessness she had been holding back spilled out. "I hate that they treat you like this," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not fair. You've done nothing but help people, and they just—" "Julia," Anthony interrupted softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay. It's not okay," she shot back, her eyes welling with tears. "Why don't you ever stand up for yourself?" Anthony sighed, his gaze steady but filled with a quiet sadness. "I've learned that fighting every battle isn't worth it," he said. "Sometimes the best way to win is to let the storm pass. But I also know when it's time to act." Julia wiped her eyes, her anger giving way to determination. "So what do? We can't just let them get away with this." Anthony thought for a moment, then nodded. "We won't," he said, "but we'll handle it on our terms." The next morning, the school buzzed with anticipation for the pep rally. Students filed into the gymnasium, their cheers and chatter echoing off the high ceilings. Bright streamers and balloons adorned the bleachers, and a stage had been set up at one end of the court. Chris and his friends were already in position, their prank supplies hidden in a nearby storage closet. Anthony went about his usual tasks, his face calm and unreadable. But beneath the surface, he was quietly preparing. He had moved through too many battles in his life to let a group of teenagers shake him. His focus wasn't on himself, it was on Julia and the lesson she was about to learn about courage and integrity. As the rally began, Chris signaled to his friends. They slipped away from the crowd, retrieving the bucket of dirty mop water they had stashed earlier. The plan was simple. Wait for Anthony to walk past the stage, then tip the bucket over him from above. The hidden camera, cleverly positioned to capture the moment, would do the rest. But Julia was ready. She had positioned herself near the storage closet, pretending to look through her sketch pad while keeping an eye on Chris's group. When she saw them sneaking away, she followed, quietly, her heart pounding. "Hey!" she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. Chris and his friends froze, turning to see Julia standing a few feet away. Her hands trembled, but she held her ground. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice steady. Despite the fear bubbling inside her, Chris smirked, trying to play it cool. "None of your business, Parker. Go back to your little doodles." Julia stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You're not doing this," she said firmly. "You don't get to treat people like garbage just because you're unhappy with your own life." Chris's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Why do you care so much about him? He's just a janitor. He's more than that, Julia shot back. He's a better person than you'll ever be. And I'm not going to let you humiliate him. The tension in the air was palpable. Chris's friends shifted uncomfortably, glancing between him and Julia. For a moment it seemed like Chris might back down, but then he sneered. What are you going to do, Parker? Stop us all by yourself? Julia didn't flinch. If I have to, yes. Before Chris could respond, a new voice cut through the standoff. Is there a problem here? Anthony stepped into view, his presence calm but commanding. His gaze swept over the group, landing on Chris. Because if there is, I'd like to hear about it. Chris's confidence crumbled under Anthony's steady gaze. He stammered, searching for an excuse, but Anthony held up a hand. No need. To explain, Anthony said. I think I've seen enough. For the first time, Chris looked unsure of himself. The prank had been derailed, and his carefully crafted plan was falling apart. Julia stood beside Anthony, her heart racing but filled with pride. Anthony turned to Julia and gave her a small nod of approval. Then he addressed Chris and his friends. The choice is yours, he said simply. You can walk away, or you can learn what happens when you cross a line. Chris hesitated, then muttered something under his breath before signaling for his friends to leave. As they disappeared into the crowd, Julia felt a wave of relief and triumph wash over her. Thank you, she said quietly to Anthony. He smiled. You didn't need me, Julia, he said. You handled it yourself. But Julia shook her head. I wouldn't have had the courage if it weren't for you. Anthony placed a hand on her shoulder. Courage is something you find within yourself, he said. And you've got more of it than you realize. The day of the prank was approaching, and tension simmered beneath the surface of Roosevelt High School. Chris and his friends spent every free moment in hushed conversations, carefully plotting the details of their stunt. The plan had grown, increasingly elaborate, fueled by Chris's determination to get a reaction out of Anthony. They scouted locations, rehearsed their timing, and made sure every detail was perfect. For Chris, this wasn't just about the prank anymore. It had become a personal mission to break through Anthony's unflappable demeanor. Meanwhile, Julia's unease had reached a boiling point. She had overheard snippets of Chris's conversations, just enough to know that whatever they were planning involved Anthony. Her anger burned hot, but so did her fear. Confronting Chris and his friends meant risking her already fragile social standing, but the thought of staying silent while Anthony was humiliated was unbearable. After school one day, Julia lingered near the gym, waiting for Anthony to finish mopping the floor. She had resolved to warn him, though she wasn't entirely sure how to start the conversation. When he finally appeared, she approached him hesitantly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Mr. Davis, she began, her voice trembling slightly, I need to talk to you. It's important. Anthony looked up from his mop bucket, his calm gaze meeting hers. What's on your mind, Julia? She hesitated, her throat tightening as she tried to find the right words. It's Chris, she said finally. He and his friends, they're planning something, a prank. It's aimed at you. Anthony didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set down his mop and leaned against the handle, his expression thoughtful. And you're telling me this because it's wrong, Julia burst out, her frustration spilling over. You don't deserve it. You've never done anything to them, and they keep pushing you. I don't understand why you don't fight back. Anthony studied her for a long moment before speaking. Julia, you have to understand something. People like Chris, people who lash out, they're usually carrying their own pain. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it explains it. Fighting back won't fix whatever's broken in him. But it's not fair, Julia insisted, her voice breaking. They're just going to keep hurting you if you let them. Anthony smiled faintly. Fairness isn't something the world guarantees us. What we can control is how we respond. Thank you for telling me, though. It means a lot. Julia's frustration didn't dissipate, but Anthony's calm demeanor had a way of grounding her. She nodded reluctantly, though a part of her still felt like more needed to be done. The next morning, Chris and his friends finalized their plan. In the cafeteria, the prank was set to take place during the school's spirit assembly, an event that would ensure maximum exposure. They had rigged a bucket of dirty mop water to fall from the stage rafters, timed perfectly for when Anthony would be cleaning up after the event. Chris had even stationed one of his friends with a phone to capture the moment, ready to upload it online. Julia, who had been sitting at a nearby table, overheard just enough to piece the plan together. Her stomach twisted in knots as she realized the scale of their scheme. She knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Julia stormed over to Chris's table and planted herself in front of him. The cafeteria seemed to fall silent as students turned to watch the unexpected confrontation. "Call it off, Chris," Julia demanded, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Chris leaned back in his chair, his trademark smirk plastered across his face. "Call what off?" he asked innocently. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Julia shot back. "The prank. It's not funny, and it's not okay." Chris's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Why do you care so much?" "Julia, he's just a janitor. It's not like he's going to lose sleep over it." Julia took a step closer, her eyes blazing. "He's not just a janitor. He's a better person than you'll ever be, Chris. And if you go through with this, you'll prove that you're nothing but a coward." The cafeteria was deathly silent now, every student hanging on their words. Chris's friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Chris himself looked momentarily shaken, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Stay out of it, Julia," he said finally, his tone cold. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Julia retorted. "And if you don't call it off, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you're planning." Chris's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Julia thought he might actually listen. But then he scoffed and stood up, towering over her. "Do whatever you want," he said, brushing past her. "It's too late to stop it anyway." Julia watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done everything she could, but it wasn't enough. As the bell rang and students began filing out of the cafeteria, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Anthony standing behind her, his expression calm but serious. "I heard what you said," he said quietly. "Thank you for standing up for me." "I tried," Julia said, her voice shaking, "but I don't think it made a difference." Anthony nodded thoughtfully. "It made a difference to me," he said. "And sometimes that's enough." As the spirit assembly approached, Julia felt a mix of dread and determination. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate, but she also knew she couldn't sit back and do nothing. With Anthony's quiet strength as her guide, she prepared herself for whatever was coming next. The day of the spirit assembly arrived with an air of excitement buzzing through Roosevelt High. The gymnasium had been transformed with banners, balloons, and a stage adorned in the school's colors. Students filled the bleachers, their chatter echoing off the walls as they waited for the event to begin. For most, it was just another routine celebration of school pride, but for Julia and Anthony, it felt like a storm was about to break. Anthony stood near the side of the stage, his janitor's cart parked neatly against the wall. He was there to clean up after the event as usual, blending into the background with his calm, unassuming presence. But Julia, seated near the front row, couldn't take her eyes off him. Her heart raced as she scanned the rafters above the stage, spotting the faint outline of the rigged bucket Chris and his friends had set up. The water glinted faintly under the gymnasium lights, a cruel reminder of what was about to happen. Chris and his crew lounged near the back of the gym, their laughter low and conspiratorial. Chris's phone was tucked into his pocket, ready to record the moment of humiliation. His confidence radiated as he leaned against the wall, arms crossed, surveying the scene like a king preparing for his crowning moment. Julia clenched her fists, the weight of her helplessness pressing down on her like a stone. As the assembly began, the principal took the stage, delivering the usual speeches about school pride and upcoming events. The cheerleading squad performed, the marching band played, and the crowd cheered. But for Julia, the noise was a dull roar in the background. Her focus was entirely on Anthony, who moved quietly along the edges of the gym, sweeping up stray pieces of confetti that had already fallen to the floor. Then came the moment. The principal announced the final act of the assembly, a short performance by the school's drama club. As the students filed onto the stage, Chris nudged one of his friends, signaling that it was time. The friend slipped out of the gym unnoticed, heading to the maintenance closet, where the rope controlling the bucket had been hidden. Julia noticed the movement immediately. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. She glanced at Anthony, who was now standing just a few feet from the stage, completely unaware of the trap above him. Panic surged through her, and before she could second-guess herself, she stood up and called out, her voice sharp and clear over the noise of the crowd. "Mr. Davis, watch out!" The gym fell silent as every head turned toward Julia. Chris froze, his smug expression replaced by a flicker of confusion and annoyance. Anthony looked up at her, his brow furrowing in mild surprise. At that moment, the friend in the maintenance closet yanked the rope. The bucket tipped forward, sending the filthy mop water cascading down. But Anthony, quick as ever, sidestepped the falling liquid with a grace that left the crowd gasping. The bucket clattered to the stage, spilling its remaining contents harmlessly onto the floor. For a moment, the gym was completely silent. Then whispers began to ripple through the crowd, followed by a few scattered laughs. But the laughter wasn't directed at Anthony, it was at Chris. Students began pointing at him, their expressions a mix of amusement and disdain. Julia's heart pounded as she looked at Anthony. He remained composed, his face calm as he surveyed the mess on the floor. Then, to everyone's surprise, he bent down, picked up the empty bucket, and placed it neatly on his cart. Without a word, he resumed cleaning as if nothing had happened. Chris's face burned red as he realized the tide had turned against him. The attention he had craved now felt like a spotlight of shame. His friends had stepped back, distancing themselves from him as the crowd murmured louder. But Anthony wasn't finished. He turned back toward the stage, his voice carrying effortlessly over the noise. "You all think that was funny?" he asked, his tone steady but firm. The gym fell silent again, all eyes on him. "Humor at someone else's expense is never funny. It's a reflection of your own insecurities." Chris shifted uncomfortably, but Anthony's gaze didn't waver. "I've lived a long life," Anthony continued, his voice taking on a softer edge. "And I've learned that respect is earned, not by tearing others down, but by lifting them up. You have the power to be better than this." The crowd was silent, many of the students avoiding Anthony's gaze. Julia felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched him. His words carried a weight that seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. Then Anthony did something unexpected. He stepped toward Chris, his expression calm but resolute. "Chris," he said, his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear, "I know you're better than this. If you ever want to prove it, my dojo is open to you." Chris's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and pushed through the crowd, his friends trailing behind him. The assembly ended shortly after, the students filing out of the gym in hushed tones. Julia stayed behind, lingering near the stage as Anthony finished cleaning up the mess. She approached him cautiously, her hands wringing together nervously. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his expression softening when he saw her. "Yes, Julia?" "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I tried to stop it. I tried to warn you earlier, but—" Anthony held up a hand, cutting her off gently. "You did more than enough," he said. "Standing up for what's right takes courage, Julia. You should be proud of yourself." Julia nodded, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. As they left the gym together, the weight that had hung over Julia since the beginning of the week began to lift. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. Anthony Davis wasn't just a janitor. He was a force to be reckoned with, and she was proud to stand by his side. The fallout from the spirit assembly lingered long after the gymnasium had emptied. Word of the failed prank spread through Roosevelt High like wildfire, and Chris Miller's once unshakable reputation as the king of the school began to crack. Students whispered about the look on his face when the bucket missed, about Anthony's calm but cutting words, and about Julia Parker's bravery in standing up to him. For the first time, Chris felt the sting of being on the receiving end of the school's gossip. Anthony, on the other hand, remained as steady as ever. The next day, he arrived at school as he always did, rolling his cart down the hallways and greeting students with his customary nods and quiet smiles. But something was different. Students who had once ignored him now stopped to say hello or offered shy apologies. A few even thanked him for what he'd said at the assembly, though he only responded with a humble, "Just doing what's right." Julia noticed the shift too. She felt a mix of pride and relief as she walked the halls. Her classmates treated her differently, not with the condescension she'd feared, but with respect. Even the teachers seemed to look at her with newfound admiration. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation with Chris wasn't over. Chris himself was a ghost of his former self. He avoided the cafeteria, the hallways, and even his usual hangout spots. His friends had distanced themselves, not wanting to share in the fallout of his humiliation. He spent most of his time alone, replaying the events of the assembly in his mind. Anthony's words haunted him, cutting deeper than he cared to admit. One afternoon, Chris found himself wandering aimlessly near the school's gym. He stopped in front of a bulletin board covered in flyers and announcements, one of which caught his eye. "Free karate lessons, Saturdays at 10 a.m., Recreation Center, all welcome." The words were simple, but they struck a chord. For a moment, Chris considered tearing the flyer down, but instead he stood there staring at it until a voice behind him startled him. "Thinking about joining us?" Chris spun around to see Anthony standing a few feet away, his hands resting on his mop handle. There was no judgment in his tone, only the quiet patience that had become his trademark. Chris hesitated, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. "I don't know," he muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Maybe." Anthony nodded, as if that was answer enough. "The dojo's always open," he said. "You don't need to decide right now." Chris looked at him, searching for any hint of mockery or pity, but found none. Anthony's calm demeanor was disarming, and for the first time, Chris felt the faintest flicker of curiosity. The following Saturday, Julia arrived at the recreation center early, eager to get in some extra practice. Anthony greeted her with his usual warm smile, but she noticed a slight tension in his shoulders. "Everything okay?" she asked. He nodded. "We might have a new student today," he said simply. Julia's heart skipped a beat. "Chris?" she asked, and Anthony's subtle smile was all the confirmation she needed. Sure enough, just as the clock struck 10, Chris walked into the dojo. He was dressed in a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt, his usual swagger replaced by a hesitant awkwardness. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on Julia. She stared back at him, her expression unreadable, before turning to Anthony. "Welcome," Anthony said, his tone as even as ever. "Glad you could make it." Chris nodded, unable to meet Anthony's gaze. He shuffled to the back of the room, trying to blend in as the class began. Anthony led them through the warm-up exercises, his voice calm and steady as he demonstrated each move. Chris struggled at first, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. He fumbled through the punches and kicks, his frustration growing with every mistake. Julia watched him out of the corner of her eye, torn between irritation and a strange sense of pity. As the class progressed, Anthony moved from student to student, offering guidance and corrections. When he reached Chris, he crouched down beside him and adjusted his stance. "Karate isn't about being perfect," he said quietly. "It's about learning. Every mistake is a step forward." Chris looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, and tried again. This time, his movements were more controlled, more deliberate. By the end of the class, Chris was drenched in sweat. But for the first time in days, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. As the students began to file out, he lingered near the door, unsure of what to say. Anthony approached him, a towel slung over his shoulder. "Good work today," he said. Chris hesitated, then muttered, "Thanks." He paused, then added, "For everything?" Anthony smiled. "See you next week." Chris nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, I'll be here." As Chris walked out of the dojo, Julia turned to Anthony, her expression one of cautious optimism. "Do you think he'll stick with it?" she asked. Anthony's smile widened slightly. "That's up to him," he said. "But I think he's ready to try." Julia nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. For the first time, it felt like things were truly beginning to change. Over the weeks that followed, Chris began to show up regularly at the Saturday karate classes. At first, his movements were hesitant, his self-consciousness evident in the way he lingered at the back of the dojo. But as time passed, the stiffness in his posture eased, replaced by a growing sense of focus. He wasn't the fastest learner, nor the most naturally skilled, but he worked hard, driven by a determination that surprised even himself. Julia watched his progress with a mix of skepticism and quiet admiration. She hadn't fully forgiven him for the prank or the countless acts of bullying that had preceded it, but she couldn't deny that Chris was trying. There were moments when she saw flashes of vulnerability in him, moments that made her question the hardened image she had of him in her mind. Anthony, as always, remained patient and encouraging. He treated Chris no differently than any of the other students, correcting his form with quiet precision and offering words of encouragement when he struggled. But Anthony also had a way of challenging Chris, pushing him to confront not just the physical demands of karate, but the mental and emotional discipline it required. One Saturday, after class had ended and the other students had left, Anthony approached Chris as he lingered by the door. "Good work today," he said, his tone as calm as ever. "You're improving." Chris shrugged, though there was a faint smile on his face. "Thanks," he said. He hesitated, then added, "I didn't think I'd like this as much as I do." Anthony nodded. "It's not just about the moves," he said. "It's about finding balance within yourself and with others. That's where the real strength comes from." Chris looked at him, the weight of those words sinking in. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I get that now." Meanwhile, word of Chris's involvement in the dojo began to spread through the school. At first, the reactions were mixed. Some students were skeptical, while others were openly surprised. But as time went on, the novelty of the situation began to fade, and Chris found himself facing fewer judgmental stares and more tentative nods of acknowledgement in the hallways. Julia, too, noticed the shift. One day, as she was walking to class, she saw Chris helping a freshman who had dropped his books in the middle of a crowded hallway. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. For the first time, she began to believe that his transformation might be genuine. Still, the real test came during an unexpected moment of tension. One afternoon, as Chris was leaving school, he found himself cornered by a group of students who had once been his closest friends. They hadn't taken kindly to his newfound humility, seeing it as a betrayal of their unspoken code of dominance. "What's with you, Chris?" one of them sneered. "Hanging out with the janitor and his little karate club? You think you're better than us now?" Chris felt the familiar surge of anger rise in his chest, the instinct to lash out bubbling just beneath the surface. But then he remembered Anthony's words. Strength isn't about fighting back every time someone pushes you, it's about controlling your response. He took a deep breath, his fists unclenching at his sides. "I'm just trying to do better," he said simply. "You should try it sometime." The group jeered and laughed, but Chris didn't flinch. He turned and walked away, his steps steady and his heart pounding with a mix of fear and pride. When he arrived at the dojo that Saturday, he told Anthony and Julia what had happened. Julia listened intently, her skepticism melting into genuine respect as Chris recounted how he'd chosen to walk away instead of fighting. Anthony smiled, his expression one of quiet pride. "That's progress," he said. "You're learning to control not just your actions, but your emotions. That's the hardest part." As the weeks turned into months, the dojo became a place of transformation for everyone involved. Julia grew more confident, her movements sharp and precise as she advanced through the ranks. Chris continued to improve, his discipline extending beyond the dojo and into his everyday life. And Anthony, though he rarely spoke of it, found a renewed sense of purpose in watching his students grow, not just as martial artists, but as people. Today, turning point came during the school's end-of-year talent showcase, an event that brought together students, teachers, and parents for an evening of performances and presentations. Anthony had been invited to lead a demonstration with his students, showcasing the skills they had developed over the past year. The gymnasium was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation as the demonstration began. Anthony stood at the center of the stage, his calm presence commanding the room as he led his students through a series of precise, synchronized movements. Julia and Chris were among them, their focus unwavering as they executed each technique with precision and grace. As the demonstration ended, the audience erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the gym. Anthony stepped forward, bowing deeply before addressing the crowd. "Karate is more than just a series of movements," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It's a way of life. It teaches us discipline, respect, and the strength to overcome our challenges, not through force, but through understanding and balance." The applause grew louder, and Anthony stepped back, allowing his students to take center stage. Julia and Chris exchanged a glance, a shared moment of pride passing between them as they bowed together. For Chris, the night marked the culmination of a journey he hadn't expected to take. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. As the crowd dispersed, he approached Anthony and Julia, his expression earnest. "Thank you," he said simply. Anthony smiled, placing a hand on Chris's shoulder. "You did the work," he said. "Be proud of that." Julia nodded, her smile soft but genuine. "You've come a long way, Chris," she said. "I mean it." As they left the gym together, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. For Anthony, Julia, and Chris, the dojo had become more than just a place to practice karate. It had become a sanctuary, a place of growth and transformation. And as they stepped into the cool night air, they knew that their journey was only just beginning.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.